It was just another Tuesday morning in Georgetown. The rain from the night before hadn't fully dried yet, and the brick sidewalks still smelled damp and metallic. The garbage truck hissed as its hydraulic system released pressure, a familiar sound that Jimmy Patterson had heard thousands of times before. He pressed the compactor button again, then once more, barely aware that this was already his 15th stop of the morning. Jimmy had worked for the District of Columbia Sanitation Department for 7 years, long enough to understand one simple truth about people. You could learn everything about them from what they threw away. The wealthy discarded perfectly good furniture without a second thought. Families hid their financial struggles inside carefully tied trash bags. Couples threw away love letters. Offices dumped confidential paperwork they assumed would vanish once it hit the landfill. Jimmy had learned not to look too closely, not because he didn't notice things, but because noticing usually led to trouble. That morning, though, something felt wrong. When Jimmy grabbed the metal trash can from a narrow townhouse on Dumbarton Street, the weight immediately caught his attention. It wasn't heavy in the way construction debris was heavy, and it wasn't light like ordinary household waste. It was inconsistent. As he tilted the can toward the hopper, the lid clanged open. A stack of loose papers slid forward. One photograph fluttered out and landed face up on the wet pavement. Jimmy froze. He bent down and picked it up. The image showed an aerial view of a military installation, hangars, fences, radar equipment, and in the corner of the photograph, stamped in dark ink, were letters he couldn't read, but he recognized them instantly. Russian. Jimmy felt his stomach tighten. It was March 1962. Just months earlier, the Cuban Missile Crisis had pushed the world to the edge of nuclear war. Every American knew the Soviets were watching, listening, probing for weaknesses. Espionage wasn't an abstract idea anymore. It was something people talked about at dinner tables and read about in the newspapers. And now Jimmy was holding what looked like a classified military photograph in the middle of a quiet Georgetown street.
His first instinct was simple: put it back, dump the trash, and forget he had ever seen it. That instinct came from experience. Jimmy had a wife and 2 kids waiting for him at home in a small apartment in Northeast Washington. He had a steady job, health benefits, a routine that paid the bills and kept his family safe. He didn't need trouble, especially not the kind that involved Russians, military secrets, and words like espionage. But as Jimmy looked down at the photograph, he noticed something else. There were more papers, more images, diagrams, pages covered in technical drawings and blocks of text written in both English and Russian. This wasn't a mistake, and it wasn't trash. Jimmy glanced up at the townhouse. 3 stories, brick exterior, black shutters, a small, well-kept garden out front. It looked exactly like every other house on the block. No guards, no cameras, nothing that suggested anything unusual, which somehow made it worse, because it meant someone ordinary was living here, someone who took out their trash every Tuesday morning, someone who assumed no one would ever look closely at what they threw away. Jimmy's partner, Frank, yelled from the driver's seat about keeping the schedule moving. They still had a dozen blocks to cover before lunch. Jimmy barely heard him. In his hands, he held a decision: ignore what he'd found and walk away, or pick up the loose papers and risk stepping into something far bigger than himself. He thought about his kids. He thought about the headlines he'd seen only months earlier about missiles in Cuba and cities that could vanish in minutes. He thought about how easily he could pretend this never happened. And he thought about the quiet danger of doing nothing. Slowly, Jimmy gathered the papers that had spilled onto the pavement. He folded them and slid them inside his jacket, pressing them flat against his chest. Then he dumped the rest of the trash into the truck. Frank kept complaining about traffic, about the rain, about his mother-in-law coming to stay for the weekend. He never noticed the classified documents hidden inches away from Jimmy's heartbeat. The truck rolled on, and Jimmy Patterson crossed a line he would never be able to uncross.
Jimmy finished his route that afternoon without really remembering any of it. He lifted cans, he emptied bins. He nodded when people waved. His body followed the routine his muscles had learned over years, but his mind stayed locked on the papers pressed against his chest. By the time the truck rolled back into the sanitation depot, Jimmy had already made another decision. He wasn't going to the police. Not yet. He didn't even know how he would explain what he'd found. A garbage collector showing up with foreign documents and military photographs sounded less like a patriotic citizen and more like someone asking to be arrested. And the FBI, that felt even worse. Jimmy had never spoken to a federal agent in his life. He wasn't sure if you could just walk into an FBI office and say you found Soviet intelligence material in someone's trash without becoming a suspect yourself. So instead, he told himself something that sounded reasonable. He would look first, just enough to understand what he was dealing with. That night, after his wife and kids had gone to bed, Jimmy spread the papers out across the kitchen table. He worked quietly, keeping the lights low, listening for footsteps in the hallway. The photographs were unmistakable. Even without training, Jimmy could tell they showed military installations, aircraft hangars, radar arrays, restricted facilities he had seen only in newspapers and magazines. The diagrams were worse. Weapons systems, communications equipment, technical specifications that clearly weren't meant for public eyes. And then there were the names, typed lists, addresses, job titles. Several of them were familiar. State Department, Pentagon, defense contractors. That was when the last doubt fell away. This wasn't academic research. This wasn't a professor's private project or a hobbyist's curiosity. This was espionage, real espionage, happening quietly in one of Washington's most respectable neighborhoods. Jimmy sat alone at the kitchen table for a long time after he finished looking through the documents. He didn't touch them again. He didn't try to organize them yet. He just sat there, staring at the wall, listening to the refrigerator hum, and wondering how his life had suddenly become so complicated.
Over the next few days, Jimmy tried to forget what he'd found. He failed. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the photograph lying on the wet pavement. Every time he picked up a trash can, he wondered what else people threw away without thinking. By the following Tuesday, he already knew what he was going to do. He made sure he was assigned to Dumbarton Street again. He didn't tell anyone why. That morning, he brought an extra pair of gloves and an empty bag folded inside his jacket. When the townhouse came into view, his heart rate jumped despite himself. The trash can was there. Same spot, same routine. Jimmy lifted the lid and glanced inside before dumping it. This time, he didn't wait for anything to fall out. He sorted quickly. Papers, photographs, more diagrams, and something new, a small notebook filled with handwritten notes in Russian. Jimmy couldn't read the language, but numbers were universal. Dates, sequences, coordinates that looked deliberate rather than random. He took what looked important and left the rest. Frank was distracted again, this time talking to a woman who had come out to move her car. Jimmy worked fast, careful not to draw attention, then finished the stop like nothing had happened. That night, Jimmy started documenting everything. He wrote down dates, descriptions, what he found and where he found it. He didn't know why he was being so methodical, only that it felt necessary. Each Tuesday, he repeated the process, and each week, the evidence grew. What started as curiosity turned into routine. Routine turned into obsession. Jimmy began thinking about the Kozlov house even on his days off. He drove past it once, then twice, then more often than he cared to admit. He noticed patterns. Viktor Kozlov left for work every morning at the same time and returned at the same hour each evening. Irene's schedule was less predictable, but she appeared to work part-time at a university library. They had visitors, not frequently, but regularly enough to notice. Always polite, always brief, often carrying briefcases. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal on the surface. And that was what bothered Jimmy the most. The operation was clean. Too clean. As the weeks passed, Jimmy found more torn letters, carefully ripped into pieces and thrown away. He reassembled them at his kitchen table like puzzles, caping fragments together late into the night. He found receipts from camera stores, film developing labs, office supply shops. The volume alone raised questions. No ordinary family needed that much photographic equipment. Jimmy began keeping a journal, not just of what he found, but of what he observed. When lights turned on and off, which cars parked outside, which license plates appeared more than once. He didn't think of himself as a spy hunter. He thought of himself as someone paying attention, though part of him wondered when attention quietly became intrusion. But paying attention had consequences. Jimmy grew distant at home.
His wife noticed his late nights, his distraction, the way he sometimes stared at nothing during dinner. When she asked what was wrong, he told her he was studying for a promotion, trying to become a supervisor. It sounded plausible enough, and it gave him an excuse. At work, the strain showed too. Frank commented that Jimmy seemed tired all the time. His supervisor pulled him aside and asked if everything was okay, if he needed time off. Jimmy said no. He couldn't stop now. Not when he was this deep. What troubled him most wasn't fear. It was doubt. Some nights, Jimmy wondered if he was doing the right thing. What if he was wrong? What if he wasn't uncovering betrayal but creating it? What if the people at Dumbarton Street were innocent, and he was destroying their lives piece by piece? But then he would look at the photographs again, and the doubt would fade. By late April, Jimmy had collected enough material to fill several folders. The pattern was undeniable. This wasn't one careless mistake. It was a system. Drop sites, meeting schedules, code names, references to locations outside Washington. And then came the letter, typed in English, addressed to someone at the Soviet embassy in Mexico City. On the surface, it read like a harmless family update. Plans for a visit, casual references to relatives, nothing incriminating. But Jimmy had read enough spy stories to recognize what it might be: coded communication. The same day, he found a receipt for film processing, 36 rolls, in a single month, all developed at the same small shop in Alexandria. That was when Jimmy decided to push the line a little further. On his next day off, he drove to the photo shop. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't ask direct questions. He told the clerk he was thinking about restoring old family photos, asked about their services, their prices. Then, casually, he mentioned the name Kozlov. The clerk's expression changed, just for a moment, but it was enough. The shop did business with many customers, the clerk said. He couldn't discuss specifics. Jimmy thanked him and left. That evening, Jimmy sat alone again at his kitchen table, surrounded by folders, notes, and photographs. For the first time since this all began, he felt certain of one thing. This was bigger than him. He had gone too far to walk away, and waiting any longer could make things worse. Jimmy decided he would contact the FBI within the week. He just needed to organize everything properly, explain it clearly, make sure he didn't sound like a paranoid garbage collector chasing ghosts.
But before he could act, the routine broke. On the first Tuesday of May, Jimmy arrived at Dumbarton Street and felt his chest tighten. The trash can wasn't there. Jimmy stood on the sidewalk longer than he should have. The Kozlov house looked exactly the same as it always had. The brick walls, the shutters, the small garden out front. Nothing appeared disturbed. Nothing suggested panic, except for one thing. There was no trash can. The neighbors on either side had their bins lined up neatly at the curb, waiting for collection. But the space in front of 2847 Dumbarton Street was empty. Jimmy felt a rush of heat move through his chest. Had they noticed? Had someone seen him sorting through the trash? Had one of their contacts warned them? Or had this been planned long before he ever touched their garbage? For the first time since this began, Jimmy felt real fear. Not the distant fear of spies and geopolitics, but the immediate fear of having pushed something too far. He told Frank he wasn't feeling well and needed to head back early. Frank complained, but he didn't argue. Jimmy drove home, changed clothes, then got into his own car and returned to Dumbarton Street. He parked down the block and waited. An hour passed, then two. Neighbors walked dogs, children came home from school, people glanced at Jimmy's car, wondering why it hadn't moved. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, a panel truck pulled up in front of the Kozlov house. Jimmy sat up straight. 2 men stepped out. They opened the back of the truck and began loading boxes. Furniture followed: chairs, lamps, a dresser. Victor and Irene Kozlov appeared at the doorway, supervising with tense expressions, scanning the street as if expecting someone to stop them. They were moving, and they were moving fast. Jimmy watched as the truck filled and drove away. Victor and Irene locked the door, climbed into their car, and followed. No goodbye, no explanation, no forwarding address. Jimmy's heart pounded. This wasn't a normal move. This was a withdrawal. Whatever had made them uneasy, it was enough to abandon the house immediately, enough to cut and run. Jimmy didn't hesitate this time. He drove straight to the FBI's Washington field office on Pennsylvania Avenue. He walked in without an appointment, carrying a folder thick with documents, photographs, notes, and receipts. The receptionist looked skeptical when he said he needed to report Soviet espionage, but she also saw his hand shaking. She made a call. 10 minutes later, Jimmy was led into a small interview room.
Two agents entered and introduced themselves as Special Agent Robert Morrison and Special Agent Patricia Chen. They didn't smile. They didn't reassure him. They asked him to start from the beginning. For the next 3 hours, Jimmy told them everything. The first photograph, the documents, the trash, the notebook, the letters, the receipts, the surveillance notes he had kept without realizing how detailed they had become.
He laid everything out on the table, explaining how and when he found each piece. The agents listened without interrupting, occasionally asking clarifying questions. Jimmy tried to read their expressions. He couldn't. When he finished, the room was quiet for a long moment. Then Morrison leaned back in his chair and looked at Chen. Something passed between them, a look Jimmy couldn't interpret. Finally, Morrison turned back to Jimmy. They knew about Victor and Irene Kozlov. They had been under surveillance for 6 months. Jimmy felt his stomach tighten, the room suddenly colder than it had been a moment before. Jimmy felt the blood drain from his face. The Kozlovs were part of a larger investigation into Soviet intelligence operations in Washington. The FBI had suspected them of espionage, but hadn't yet moved in, not because they lacked interest, but because they lacked timing. They were waiting for the Kozlovs to lead them to other members of the network, waiting to identify couriers, contacts, safe houses, waiting to expose the full structure of the operation, instead of just arresting 2 people and watching everyone else disappear. Jimmy's investigation had changed that. Something had alerted the Kozlovs. Whether it was disturbed trash, questions at the photo shop, or simple operational caution, the result was the same. They ran. The FBI lost their primary targets, and with them, the chance to roll up the entire network in one coordinated move. Jimmy felt sick. He had imagined this moment many times, sitting across from federal agents, handing over evidence, being thanked for doing the right thing. Instead, he felt like a liability. Morrison's tone wasn't angry, but it was firm. Years of careful work had been disrupted. Surveillance plans were compromised. Contacts would change routines. Some would disappear entirely. Jimmy had acted with good intentions, but intentions weren't enough in counterintelligence. The room seemed to tilt slightly as the weight of that realization settled in. He had wanted to help his country, and in doing so, he may have helped spies escape. Jimmy stared at the table, replaying every decision he'd made, every Tuesday morning, every piece of paper he'd taken, every step that had felt justified at the time. If he had gone to the FBI sooner, if he had done nothing at all, if he had trusted professionals instead of his own judgment. Then Agent Chen leaned forward. Her voice was calmer, gentler. She said Jimmy hadn't ruined everything. The evidence he had collected was real, valuable, more valuable than the Bureau had expected. The documents showed a clear pattern of long-term espionage. Combined with the FBI's own surveillance, they now had enough to issue warrants and move quickly against other suspected members of the network. More importantly, Jimmy had uncovered things the FBI didn't know. The letter to Mexico City revealed a courier route they hadn't identified. The Photoshop receipt pointed to a location they hadn't connected to the case. His notes about visitors and vehicles filled in gaps left by technical surveillance. In some ways, his amateur investigation had complemented theirs. Morrison acknowledged it reluctantly. They were frustrated about losing the Kozlovs, but it was possible the couple had been scheduled for extraction anyway. Soviet intelligence rotated operatives regularly, especially during periods of heightened tension. At least now, the Bureau could act faster. Jimmy exhaled for the first time in what felt like hours. The agents asked him to stay. They needed his help. They wanted every detail he could remember, every scrap of information, no matter how insignificant it seemed. Jimmy agreed immediately. For the rest of the night, he sat with the agents, reconstructing the past 2 months piece by piece. Trash contents, dates, observations, patterns. What emerged was a picture far larger than Jimmy had imagined. This wasn't just about 2 people. It was about a network. As the agents compared Jimmy's notes with their own files, the shape of the operation finally became clear.
Victor and Irene Kozlov were not lone actors. They were a hub. Around them existed a network of at least a dozen individuals, most of them immigrants from Eastern Europe, who had arrived in the United States during the 1950s. Some had been recruited before they ever set foot in America. Others had been approached later, quietly and patiently, after they had established themselves in jobs that offered access rather than attention. Victor's work as a translator had placed him in rooms where documents moved freely. Irene's position at the university library connected her to academics who worked as defense consultants, people who handled sensitive material without the security posture of military personnel. Together, they collected fragments. No single document was catastrophic on its own, but combined, those fragments formed a detailed picture of American military capabilities, strategic priorities, and diplomatic intentions during one of the most volatile periods of the Cold War. The trash Jimmy had been sorting through was only the surface. Beneath it lay years of careful, methodical intelligence gathering. The FBI moved quickly. Within days, warrants were issued. Surveillance teams shifted from observation to action. Homes were searched. Offices were raided. Quiet arrests took place before suspects could warn one another. Jimmy followed the developments from the sidelines, occasionally called in to clarify a detail or identify a name he had seen before. What the agents found exceeded even their expectations. Classified documents hidden inside false book covers, cameras modified for covert photography, cipher materials disguised as personal notebooks, encrypted communication devices concealed inside ordinary household objects. This wasn't casual espionage, it was professional. One of those arrested worked as a clerk at the Pentagon, quietly copying documents after hours and photographing pages before returning files to their shelves. Another was a secretary at the State Department, photographing diplomatic cables whenever offices were empty and attention was elsewhere. A third was a technician at a defense contractor, stealing radar blueprints and guidance components slowly, piece by piece, over time. Each had been chosen carefully, each had access without visibility, and each fed their information back through the same channel. The Kozlovs.
The documents Jimmy found in the trash weren't mistakes born of ignorance. They were the byproducts of pressure. The early 1960s were a critical moment for Soviet intelligence. Tensions were high over Berlin. Cuba had nearly triggered a nuclear exchange. Vietnam was escalating. The arms race demanded constant updates. Moscow wanted results. And that pressure had consequences. The Kozlovs had grown careless. They had photographed too much too quickly. They had stopped destroying evidence properly. They had treated routine trash collection as invisible, assuming no one would ever look closely at what they discarded. That assumption had been wrong. As arrests mounted, the scope of the damage became clearer. Programs had been compromised, military strategies exposed, diplomatic negotiations potentially influenced by information that should never have left secure channels. The FBI worked with the Pentagon to assess what had been lost and what could still be protected. Procedures were changed, access protocols tightened, entire departments were reviewed. The cost was measured not just in documents, but in trust. Trials followed, many of them conducted quietly to avoid revealing intelligence methods. Jimmy testified in several cases, describing how he had found the materials and how they had accumulated over time. Defense attorneys challenged the evidence aggressively. They argued that materials taken from trash constituted illegal searches, that Jimmy had acted without authority, that the chain of custody was flawed. The courts disagreed. Garbage placed on public property for collection carried no expectation of privacy. What had been thrown away was legally abandoned. Jimmy's actions, however unconventional, were lawful. 6 of the 8 arrested individuals were convicted. Sentences ranged from 10 to 30 years in federal prison. 2 were acquitted due to insufficient direct evidence linking them to espionage, though investigators remained convinced of their involvement. The network, however, was finished. The Kozlovs themselves remained the exception. They had vanished. The FBI tracked their movements as far as Mexico City, then Havana. After that, the trail went cold. Intelligence suggested they eventually returned to Moscow, beyond the reach of American courts. They would never face trial, but they would never operate again.
Jimmy watched all of this unfold with a complicated mix of relief and regret. The network had been destroyed, but the people at its center had escaped. He wondered whether things might have ended differently if he had acted sooner, or later, or not at all. There was no way to know. What he did know was that his small, ordinary actions had set enormous forces in motion, forces he barely understood when he first picked up that photograph on a wet Georgetown street. In the shadow world of espionage, victories were rarely clean, and consequences were rarely simple. After the arrests, Jimmy Patterson returned to work. There was no ceremony, no handshake in front of cameras, no quiet medal slipped across a desk. The FBI classified his role in the investigation. They didn't want foreign intelligence services to know that something as mundane as trash collection had helped expose a major spy network.
If spies learned to fear garbage trucks, future investigations would become harder. So Jimmy went back to his route. Same streets, same cans, same hydraulic hiss of the compactor every morning. At home, nothing changed on the surface. His wife knew only that he had helped the government with something important and that he couldn't talk about it. She didn't press him. She didn't need to. She could tell the weight of it still followed him. Their children grew up believing their father was just a sanitation worker, and in a way, he was. Years passed. The Cold War continued. Crises came and went. Berlin, Vietnam, nuclear treaties signed and broken. New spy cases replaced old ones in classified files. Jimmy rarely spoke about what had happened in the spring of 1962, but he thought about it often. He thought about Viktor and Irene Koslov. Were they living comfortably in Moscow, celebrated as heroes, or quietly sidelined for having failed? Did they ever talk about the garbage man who unraveled their operation? Did they understand how close they had come to being caught? Jimmy would never know. What he did know was that their downfall hadn't come from sophisticated surveillance technology or masterful counterintelligence maneuvers. It came from complacency, from assuming that no one paid attention to what was thrown away, from forgetting that every system relies on ordinary people doing ordinary jobs. In 1985, Jimmy retired after 30 years with the sanitation department. At his retirement party, his supervisor joked about how thorough Jimmy had always been, how nothing ever slipped past him. Everyone laughed. Only Jimmy understood what the joke truly meant. He smiled, accepted his pension, and went home. Years later, after the Cold War had ended, an archive slowly began to open. The FBI declassified parts of the Koslov case. A journalist tracked Jimmy down in a quiet retirement community in Virginia. Jimmy was in his 70s by then. His wife had passed away. His children were grown with families of their own.
He lived a quiet life, far removed from the tension and secrecy that had once defined his days. The journalist wanted to write a book. Jimmy agreed. Enough time had passed. Over several interviews, Jimmy told the story from the beginning. The photograph, the trash, the choices he made without knowing the full consequences. He showed declassified copies of some of the documents the FBI had eventually given him as a keepsake. He spoke about the fear, the doubt, the guilt he felt when he learned his actions had forced the Koslovs to flee. But he also spoke about pride. Not pride in catching spies, but pride in having acted when it would have been easier to look away. The book was published decades after the events it described. It became a bestseller among readers fascinated by Cold War history and the hidden mechanics of espionage. Jimmy was invited to speak at historical societies and universities. People asked him what it felt like to make such an important discovery by accident. He always gave the same answer. He hadn't been trying to be a hero. He had just been doing his job and paying attention. In a world obsessed with intelligence agencies, covert operations, and shadowy professionals, Jimmy's story stood out for a different reason. It reminded people that national security doesn't depend only on experts. It also depends on ordinary citizens noticing when something feels wrong and having the courage to act. The journalist asked Jimmy one final question during their last interview. If he could go back, knowing how it would turn out, knowing that the Koslovs would escape even though their network would be destroyed, would he do it again? Jimmy didn't hesitate. Yes, because the alternative would have been worse. Doing nothing. Letting secrets flow unchecked. Pretending that responsibility belonged only to someone else. Better to act imperfectly, Jimmy said, than to stay silent while something wrong continued. The question he left unanswered was one for the reader. If you found something dangerous in someone's trash, something that could put your family at risk, your livelihood at risk, even your freedom at risk, would you have done what Jimmy did, or would you have looked away? Stories like this are rarely told, and many more remain hidden, waiting quietly to be noticed. In the quiet war of espionage, sometimes the most important victories come not from spies or soldiers, but from people doing ordinary jobs who refuse to ignore what's right in front of them.